Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to welcome the director, Jeff Nichols, and the stars of the film, Ruth Negga and Joel Edgerton.
I've done a couple of Q&As just by myself, and no one ever stands when it's just me. So I appreciate that, because I know it was just for me.
Well, thank you for coming with your beautiful, beautiful film. And as of this morning, I hadn't seen it since the Cannes Film Festival, and I snuck into the test screening and was a little bit late. And what I want to say to you, Ruth and Joel, is that you bring such humanity to these characters that it's just such an emotional experience. I literally came in when you had just gotten the phone call from Bernie Cohn. We're friends, so I call him Bernie. And literally, just from that one phone call, by the time you hung up, I was literally in tears. And there are so many moments that both of you that bring to this film, and I just have to say I'm just overwhelmed with these performances. Thank you. I wanted to ask you, Jeff, and I know that initially I read somewhere that there might have been some reticence to take on a project that you didn't conceive from birth, like your other films, just out of your imagination with no basis, in this case, of a very true story, as moving as it was. And obviously, thank goodness that you changed your mind, but when did you come to the point where you really, we know this could have been a courtroom drama, could have been many different ways that it presented. When did you realize this was this incredible love story?
Well, it was really, I was approached by the producers with Nancy Bursky's documentary, The Loving Story. I'm not sure if any of you all have seen it. It was on HBO. It's great. Yes, you can clap. It's awesome. And that was my first experience with the story. I was actually quite ashamed of the fact that I didn't know about The Loving Story. I didn't know about Loving versus Virginia, which was part of the reason why I took on the project, because I feel like this is a foundational part of our American history, not our civil rights history, but our American history. And why is this not being taught in schools? Why am I just hearing about this now in my 30s? And I sat down to watch the documentary, and Nancy did this really beautiful thing. She unearthed, with the help of Bernie Cohen and Phil Hirschkopf, I believe, she unearthed this amazing archival footage from the mid-'60s. A documentary filmmaker named Hope Ryden had gone down to visit the Lovings before the Supreme Court decision, and it's this beautiful black and white footage that she just lets play. There's no voiceover over it necessarily, maybe minimal music, but not even. And so for a large section of the documentary, you just get to sit with these really amazing, beautiful, elegant, but at the same time, true, sincere, hardworking, blue-collar people. And because it's a documentary, in the last third, it downshifts into the court case, which is fascinating. If you can find out about it, the way they navigated the state courts, the federal courts, into the Supreme Court, I mean, it's a really interesting story. It had nothing to do with the Lovings. You know, obviously they were the reason the court case was propelled in the first place, and Mildred was very much the instigator of getting that court case rolling and continuing it rolling. But their day-to-day lives were not involved in that procedure. And at the end of the documentary, Bernie Cohen, the real Bernie Cohen, is recounting the verdict and receiving the news of the verdict. And it's a jubilant part of the documentary. You find yourself smiling, and it's triumphant. But then Nancy off screen very astutely says, well, how did you tell the Lovings? And he says, oh, I think we called him on the phone. I was like, well, what was that phone call like? And where were they? And why weren't they there? And what was going on in their lives? And that kind of cemented this approach of, well, I want to make a film from their point of view. Even if I don't exactly know what they were doing all the time, I want to be with them, because that seems to be the point of all this. It is not a political story. It is, their act of marriage was not an act of defiance or even a symbol. It was just an act of love. And if you focus on these two people at the center of it, there is no agenda. They weren't trying to make you believe something or make you do something or experience something. They just were trying to experience something for themselves. So it felt very appropriate to tell it from their perspective.
Yeah. And it's amazing how that resonates, and that the fact of love, in a sense, this is everybody that I speak to who's seen it said, I didn't know about that. And, but the love story almost supersedes that in a way, and it's kind of hard to believe, but when you think about it, that the power of love versus this court ruling and what it meant to everybody are so connected, at least through this film, and I think for people to see it in that way is great. Now, for Ruth, for you, were you aware of this story before, and how did you come to be involved in the film?
I think I'd heard about it. I think it was somewhere in orbiting my brain. I think I'd read about them. I think I'd actually read Mildred Loving's obituary somewhere, and I was just fascinated that it was like a slip of a thing, and what she'd achieved, what she and Richard had achieved. I just thought, wow, why weren't they more well known? Why weren't they sort of tripping off the tongues of most people? So, and I'd watched snippets of Nancy's documentary, but I hadn't seen it all until Francine Mazer, casting director, gave my name to Jeff and Sarah Green, his producer, and they invited me in to audition. And Jeff very kindly sent me some scenes from his script, and with Nancy's documentary, which I pored over for days, watching the footage of this beautiful couple, and I mean, really invaluable to have that footage of them, for practical purposes, see how they moved, how they spoke, and how they were with one another and their children and their family. It was really quite beautiful and quite moving, and I really felt it was important to for this film to be made, to pay homage to them and what they achieved. And so, yeah, I was determined to be a part of that.
Well, thank goodness you were determined. Joel, now I know you and Jeff worked together in his most recent film. Did there come a point where you said, hey, buddy, what's next? Or Jeff, you said,
It was
I
shameless
think you could play
lobbying.
a Southerner.
Shameless.
Jeff could read you my recent text exchanges with him where I'm badgering him into what's next. Yeah, we were kind of towards the end of the experience of Midnight Special, and he kind of, outside of work hours, mentioned this. And in a very informal fashion, and it was like, I guess about a year and a half before we started shooting. And that was the first point for me of knowing anything about Richard and Mildred. And I'm from Australia, and so I thought maybe this is something that most Americans know about, but I don't, because I have my own modern history that I was concerned about remembering when I was at school, which again so many things in Australia don't get taught at school that should be taught in terms of history and racial history.
Are they
and
just teaching you French Revolution like they did to us here?
Yeah, it's weird. They kind of, when I was in high school and primary school, I remember, without getting too deep into the debate about, race and the history of a nation, or a modern history of a nation, is big gaps in stuff that happened that then you find out about later. But I suspect with Richard and Mildred that part of the reason why we don't know about them so much is as big of a kind of a leap forward in civil rights that occurred because of these two unwilling kind of heroes. It was a 9-year, as you saw in the movie, like a 9-year slow pressure cooker kind of oppressive situation, rather than like a knife's edge, flash of violence, which would have been more newsworthy, I guess. So the Supreme Court, if you imagine in terms of the newsworthiness of it, the Supreme Court ruling would have been like, that's a pretty good news story, but a riot or a murder is so much more interesting, isn't it? And so I suspect that's part of the reason. But one of the great things about movies to me, because I don't read a lot, and often, my patchwork quilt of understanding of the world is often brought to me through movies, because I have a love of movies. And I think I've heard all these guys reflect that as well, that hopefully because of what Jeff's done with this movie and what Nancy Bursky has done that inspired us to then go on and do that is going to put the names of Richard and Mildred very much in that very specific and dotted timeline of civil rights change so far in America.
I guess I would be remiss if I didn't. I don't think I have to point it out that you both have lovely accents from other countries, and even from your perspective as well, dealing with these very precise Southern accents from Virginia, and I'm trying to remember the name of the town.
Central Point.
Central Point in Caroline County. What kind of thoughts were going through your mind, and yours as well, about being the authenticity of the language?
Well, I didn't have to say anything.
But those looks were definitely Southern, though.
And even when I did, Jeff's first note to me after week 1, when I went up to him all nervous, I said, how's the accent going when I do speak? And he said, I have one note for you. I want to understand you less. I said, I can do that.
And you did. This was tricky. I made this movie called Mud, and when I wrote that movie, I wrote it for Matthew McConaughey. I often write parts for Michael Shannon. When I wrote this film, I wrote them for Richard and Mildred because we had all this documentary footage. We had all of these amazing Gravelette photographs from Life magazine. That's who I was imagining. So it wasn't just about finding someone that could recreate the voice, which was hugely important because I'd heard them as well as watching them. I needed to find people that looked like them. And as you can see from the photograph at the end of the film of the real people, there is a striking similarity between these two and Richard and Mildred. So it began almost physically, but it's two separate casting processes, which is the first is Ruth, and I'll tell you from my side of the story. Francine Maisler had a casting session for us. This was a couple years before we even had financing, but I was in LA working on Midnight Special, and so we decided to do this. And the first person she called in was Ruth. And Ruth, I wasn't familiar with Ruth's work, I'm ashamed to say. And so she walked in, and the first thing that went through my mind was she's too short, because Mildred was quite tall, which is why they called her String Bean. And I said, well, that's unfortunate for her. And and she sat down, and you could tell she was nervous. And I get really nervous in those situations because I want the actors to do a great job. So I'm nervous then and won't look her in the eye, and I'm all sheepish. And she sits down, and her posture straightens, like Mildred's, and her face changes because Mildred would do this thing where she would purse her lips. She can do it better than I can. And then she began the scene. We spoke very little. And I think we had 4 scenes, and she just nailed it. And afterwards, she stood up, and I wanted to give her a hug to let her know she did a great job, and I wanted to stand next to her to see how short she was. And I remember giving her a hug, and she started to speak to me in this Irish accent. I was like, that's so bizarre. But it was too late. The die was cast. She was already Mildred. You know, there was just no question. When we went out for financing, you know, people would ask, and who's going to play Mildred? And I'd say Ruth Negga, and they'd say, who's that? And I would give them this QuickTime file of the audition, and I'd say, well, it's Mildred, just look. And they were all convinced. There was never any question. So then it was the question of Richard, and Joel and I were working together on Midnight Special, and I mean, it started off that Richard was, you know, he was extraordinarily fair-skinned and blonde, almost red-headed blonde, but with this dying hairline back, and really it was the teeth. He just had horrible, horrible teeth, which is a character trait, actually. And so I was looking at Joel, and I was like, if you kind of close one eye and imagine him losing a little weight and like cutting male pattern baldness into his hair, I was like, we could get there. And but what I witnessed with Joel on Midnight Special, not that anyone's seen that film, Joel played a Texas State Trooper, and we took he was looking for a real world example of a Texas accent, and that amazing Errol Morris documentary, The Thin Blue Line, we took a detective from Vidor, Texas, and I know that documentary backward and forward, and Joel said, look, his voice is a little high pitched, I want to lower it an octave or whatever it is. I'll send you an example of what that's going to be. And I thought maybe he had some program where he would just lower the audio from the documentary. And he sent it to me, and that's obviously what he had done. That's obviously what he had done because it sounded exactly like it. And then like halfway through, he got stuck on a word. I think it was door. I was like, oh my gosh, this is Joel. He sounded just like the guy, just like him. And once I'd seen that facility, I started thinking about Richard, and I knew there was just enough of Richard's real voice from all of this footage that if you give this to an actor with this skill, he's going to nail it, you know, as well as the countenance and the body posture and everything else. And he did. You know, they both did. They did the work. And I was worried about, you know, as a Southern filmmaker, which I'll consider myself such, I could go cast someone with a great Arkansas accent or Mississippi accent because Southern accents, the South is not a monolith. You know, people in Arkansas sound very, very different than people in Alabama or Georgia or even North Carolina or Virginia, which is a very strange accent, especially in the 60s. It's got a coastal influence. They say a boot rather than about. There are all these specific details. I was afraid if I just cast a Southern actor, they would just show up with their great Southern accent and not necessarily do the mechanical work to sound like Richard, because I didn't want someone to just sound like they're from the South. I wanted them to sound like Richard and like Mildred. So that was the thinking. It wasn't really about, oh, are they American, are they Australian or Irish? It was, I just want people to represent Richard and Mildred as closely as possible.
Great. Joel, did you realize you had that talent of this, being able to do that with voices, and it's something you've done as an actor before?
I don't know.
Precision?
With accents, I don't know if it's. I think it's all hard work. Like, I don't find it easy to do. Although when I was growing up, I always wonder about. And there's a handful of Australian actors I know who are very good at accents. And I've talked to a few of them, and we all suppose that part of the reason is everything we listened to on TV when we were growing up was American TV. And I watched the Brady Bunch and Eight is Enough and Gilligan's Island and Happy Days, like just devoured that TV. And I hear kids today in Australia playing with each other in American accents. So I think that facility is born then. And then from the point where if you're lucky enough or privileged enough or whatever to be an actor and have those tasks put in front of you, then you got to do the work, I think. And for me, because I find it difficult and yet interesting, I try and find specific references rather than a general, like this is a general Texan accent or a general Boston accent. Like, what's the specificity you can put into the work? And if you have the real person in front of you, albeit in real life or just in footage, then that just clears the field of any other confusion, and you can just strive for that.
And Ruth, you obviously did this work preparing for the audition. You were Mildred by the time you met.
Well, yeah, I think I would echo Joel very much. Growing up in Ireland and England, that we grew up watching America. Our gaze was to over here. So I think that with the accents were familiar. To a lot of us. But yeah, I think that if you wait around for some divine inspiration, you'll be waiting around for a while. So I think that you're right, the graft it's about work. It's about hard work, and I think that. I think we both really wanted to be as accurate as possible, to be specific, because why not? And it is a very specific accent. It's quite peculiar, and they were quite isolated towns, so it was a very, and also it's a different time, so it's kind of an archaic sort of accent. People talked in a different rhythm then, in different tonality and timbre. And also, they weren't, I think because they were country people, and I think they spoke sort of, they spoke differently. They didn't shout, and they spoke, they were very sparse with language. So there's all these different things that contribute.
And I think also, can I just add to that, we take our lead from our captain, and I got a very clear sense early on, I'm sure Ruth did as well, that Jeff was striving for that authenticity of this story, not to recreate the documentary, but to really pay respect to the couple, and that what he was looking to do was somewhat take a realistic view on all aspects of that story, of the community in terms of its look, the clothes, the cars. Shooting in Virginia, which sort of emanated its own kind of nice ghosts and shady sort of feelings that helped everything, and that meant that we were striving for the authenticity of creating Richard and Mildred, and as Ruth mentioned earlier, not just the individual characters, but what they were like as a character together, and that was all because of Jeff's interest from the top down, and you watched everybody kind of strive to fall into place behind that to make that vision work for him.
Well, thank you for that explanation there. Shall we open it up for questions? See if what the audience has to say here. We have mic runners here.
So once you cast both Ruth and Joel, at what point did you notice this incredible chemistry between the two of them? Was it in a second casting that you brought them back together?
Yeah, we had lunch together, but that was more just so everybody could meet. And with hindsight, it seems silly, but I don't rehearse. It's just not something that's really in my process. And so I just never thought about it. I just never questioned it. Joel's such a likable guy, and Ruth and I fell in so easily with one another. We had dinner finally when I offered her the part, and just hit it off. I just assumed, I just assume everyone's going to get along. And it really wasn't until we were on set when I saw the two together that I was like, oh yeah, that's great. They really seem like they're in love. And I know that seems so foolish, but it just, I was never worried about it. Maybe I should have been, probably.
All right, additional questions?
So, very important film, very special film. Thank you very much. Did you think long and hard about keeping it on film?
Yeah, well, I didn't think that long and hard about it because it just was never a question for me. He's asking about shooting on film. This is my 5th feature. and I've directed them all on film. I think especially with a period piece, it was just crucial to everyone forgetting that we were, a present-day group of people making a film from the past. I just, honestly, I haven't shot enough on digital. I did a commercial for the first time ever for the Olympics a couple years ago, and that was the first thing I ever shot digitally. And it's just this is what I know how to do. I know how to make movies on film, and so no, it was never really a question for me. And the great thing, the great difference, because you can make digital look really good, but it's at the end of the process typically. You have a DIT on set who's kind of making it look acceptable right in the moment, kind of your dailies colorist, for lack of a term. And but it still looks like bad soap opera to me. And I did, when I edited this commercial together, it was the same. And they're like, well, it's going to look good later. The problem is you're in the editing room looking at this footage, and you're making creative decisions, aesthetic decisions, based on the dailies. And if they don't have that look baked into them, it's very hard for me to choose. And so film's kind of always been a necessity for me. Hopefully, it'll be that way for the rest of my career. But
We have
one thing you did really well, which I was impressed with, was capturing a mood of oppression without being heavy-handed at all. You conveyed a certain amount of fear, especially that one scene where the truck is chasing you. I mean, we all ended up laughing, but you really captured a moment there. So I was curious about your thought process in being able to convey that atmosphere without being heavy-handed or really graphic or anything like that.
I guess it's two parts. One of the producers, when they first came to Austin, which is where I live, to talk to me about doing the project, one of them asked a very reasonable question, which was, who do you think the bad guy is? And for a movie, that's a fair question, but for this, it didn't make any sense. I said, I think the world is the bad guy. I think this idea, this threat, this psychological threat of danger that these people had to live under constantly, especially when she chooses to bring the family back into Virginia and live in hiding, how oppressive that threat must have been. And if you take that a little bit further, you think about a white man in the Jim Crow South making this decision so that he has to live under this threat that so many people in the black community always had to live under, still to this day probably live under in certain circumstances. What a fascinating way to extend the point of view of that threat to an audience that might typically not experience it that way. You're viewing it from arm's length, well, that's happening to them, and isn't that terrible that that's happening to them, but maybe it draws a portion of the audience into that idea in a way that typically doesn't happen, which is just purely the benefit's an odd word to say, but the benefit of Richard and Mildred's story specifically. But it's very difficult, that back third of the film, because since they were in hiding, there were very few specific details about that part of their life. That is literally it's why the documentary does what it does, partially, is it just kicks into the court case. And in lieu of inventing harrowing moments, which I'm sure they experienced far more harrowing things than what are shown in the film even, since I didn't have a specific example of them that I could be inspired from or tie something to, I just decided to focus on this psychological threat and try and have it be pervasive and just hang over the whole experience. But thank you for noticing.
Just on the left. Yeah, I just was wondering if you had ever followed up with their 3 children to get any of their memories or their influence on your film.
So out of the 3 children, Sydney, Donald, and Peggy, only Peggy is still alive. Both of the boys died of cancer. These are poor people. This is a hard life, and I don't know the specifics of their death really, but this is real life. And Peggy was was very gracious to us. When I first went to Virginia in 2012, before I started writing, she was one of the first people I sat down with and had dinner with. She's much like Richard. She doesn't speak a lot and plays it very close to the vest. And I think, too, she was sizing me up. And I was trying to get personal details, and they were just very hard. But you have to remember, she was 5 years old when the court case came down in '67. She wasn't even around for the first half of this story. She wasn't born yet. And so it was hard to get specifics. I was asking questions like, was there music in the house? I was asking just kind of random personal things. So I didn't really get a lot out of Peggy in terms of specifics, but what we did get, in my opinion, was confidence. It was kind of this thumbs up of, okay, you've got this. We shared the script with her before we began filming, which was terrifying. And I went to her home. She still lives in Central Point. And she was sitting in this big lazy boy recliner. And it was about 10 minutes in, and she was just flipping through the script like this. And I was like, oh, she hates it. She just hates it. And then she looked up, and she had tears in her eyes, and she said, they're all gone. And you very much realize that these are not characters on a page. This is not some thing that I'm, sprouting from my brain to affect the audience. That these are real people, and you have a responsibility to their memory and legacy. And I think she just gave us, very quietly, permission to keep going.
So, Ruth and Joel, did that responsibility weigh heavily on you as well in that same manner that Jeff is talking about?
Yes, I think so. I think, of course. But I visited Peggy with Jeff, and we didn't really have much to say to another because I didn't really want to. I don't want to sort of. I don't know. I think it was enough, actually. Funnily enough, because the film is a few words, but it was enough to just sit with her. Because I'd been watching her for 2 years in this documentary, so it was kind of overwhelming to actually finally meet her. And I just felt it was important just to sit with her and sort of, exchange energies, because I was going to be playing her mom. And when I left, she said something so brilliant to me and so generous. She said, "You have a good spirit to play my mom." And it wasn't like I was looking for that, but I was so grateful because it was very freeing, because then I thought, now I can get on with the business of doing a really good job. And I think that, what the most important thing you can do is not let that responsibility paralyze you and make decisions for you. So you sort of have to accept that is a consequence, but that the best thing you can do is get on with it and do your job to the best of your abilities.
And Joel, I know Richard died not really relatively soon after this. Did you get some feedback from his daughter, and how that responsibility weighed on you?
I got very nervous when I realized Peggy was on set for the first time, and it was during the scene that post the car, Richard feeling the paranoia stuff of Richard feeling like the car was following him home from work, and the getting of the rifles, and and then someone came and told me, I think it was Sarah came and told me that Peggy was on set, and I got really nervous and very self-conscious, and then I went down to see her at the monitor afterwards, and she gave me, she was very kind of like, "Hi, nice to meet you," and then she called me Daddy and gave me a hug, and I think it was kind of a jokey thing, but at the same time, because I was, Jeff had given me the representation of Richard in a way, and she was so young when he had passed away. But I mean, she gave me a couple of really interesting insights. I remember her telling us that she remembered that, or she had heard, or you know, when your memories mixed up as a child as well, that there was a lot of laughter in the house, and her dad, she'd heard, had a great sense of humour, which was a nice way of filling in the gaps that weren't really there in the documentary, because Richard was so interminably shy, and you could see him in the documentary kind of wishing that everyone would just go away. But then what happened when they were gone? You know, and that's always the question, I think, for an actor when you go, I have this part of the information, but I don't have the other part. But I think also just, not just Peggy, just being in Virginia was so important. Going to the jail that still exists, where they were housed. And, you know, and for me, a lot of it was my point of view of watching Ruth's response to a lot of these places as well. Not just my own response, but watching her response to being in the cemetery where Mildred and Richard are buried side by side. Watching her response to standing inside the jail where Mildred was kept for many days longer than Richard was. And that town itself and everything that it threw up, good and bad, was very vital to our, not just the work that we did, but the responsibility, I think, that we felt like together, all of us were cradling something very special.
I know we're going to have to wrap up, but I just want to say a couple things that for Ruth and Joel. I think the most amazing testament is when you see a film and you cannot imagine anyone else playing those characters. And I think forever we all will feel that way.
Thank you.
And Jeff, thank you for being the captain and making a film that's not only important but moving. And as you said, this is real life, and it represents so much bigger than the film, but it's also art, and you succeeded on every level. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.